I was saying that before I unmuted, that I've had an opportunity to do a quick reading of this book, a substantial part of the book. And I think it's a very interesting contribution to this question of what the Dravidian experiences. I do think that it'll be hard to justify the proposition that there is a Dravidian model, but the experiences which in some respects are very coherent and it's a very interesting argument. I think there is an element of romanticization. People have used different words of these experiences, or the Dravidian model as they call it, but that may have been necessary to emphasize the points that they are making, that it is possible to do both social development, focusing on eliminating or reducing status-based inequities, injustice, combining that with dynamic economic development. And we can point away, I think the comparison with Kerala is a bit tricky. I think we are on slippery ground if you make mechanical comparisons with Kerala, because Kerala, in terms of human development, is way and ahead. It's superior to Tamil Nadu's on every count. Tamil Nadu may have narrowed the gap in recent decades, but development indicators for human development indicators for Kerala is almost unique among major states in this respect. The one clear gap in Tamil Nadu's performance is the space given to local institutions, decentralization. There's the constitutional arrangement, but when you talk about its record in devolution of finances, Tamil Nadu's record functionaries, and also rent seeking or corruption, I think Tamil Nadu is much worse off than Kerala in this respect. I don't have the competence to assess this very important and provocative chapter. I mean, in a positive sense, provocative. This chapter 6, transforming rural relations, agrarian relations, because I've not followed this very closely, but certainly there's a literature which shows that landlessness, proportion of landless agricultural laborers is very high, or has been very high in Tamil Nadu, higher than in most other states. So I would defer to the experts, those scholars on agrarian relations, agricultural economics, and so on, to assess that. But if it can be established, prima facie, there is an attempt to do that, although there's not been any impressive record of land reform in Tamil Nadu, in actual practice, as the authors point out, there has been a redistribution of land to people belonging to the lower castes, and to some extent Dalits also. If that is accepted, if that can be substantiated, then that is, I think, a considerable achievement, which would be a surprise. I think a very important point that it may have figured in earlier reports or studies with respect to entrepreneurship, but I think the emphasis and the evidence produced to make that proposition that the Dravidian movement or the Dravidian experiences have been quite successful in promoting a more broad-based, a more heterogeneous entrepreneurial class, representing to a substantial extent people belonging to the backward classes, then I think that's a very important point, and it's something that Tamil Nadu can be proud of compared with many other states. Again, I'm no expert in this area, but that struck me. The emphasis on this, the highlighting of this struck me as a very important conclusion that comes out of this book. There's no doubt that Tamil Nadu has many advantages. There's a whole history. I strongly agree, or firmly agree with the authors that the quest, the struggle for social justice, promoting social justice, is a very important characteristic of the self-respect movement. I have some problems about the Justice Party, because the Justice Party's conservative role, elitist role, and then the transition to the Periyar-led self-respect movement. I've written on this in the past, some political essays on this question. I have problems with establishing a continuity between one and the other, but certainly when it comes to the socially radical aspect of Periyar's thinking on this and his activities over a very long period, it was extremely long-lived. I strongly agree that I think has provided an engine for taking this development trajectory forward. It's a very important aspect, and the emphasis on affirmative action, caste-based reservation. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court has not endorsed the idea of including economically oppressed or backward communities, because that is not part of the constitutional scheme. But insofar as making a distinction between the most backward sections of the backward classes and the rest, I think there are some very good initiatives, particularly during the period of when Chief Minister Karunanidhi, the idea of privileging first generation graduates and so on. I think these are almost unique in the Indian political context. So this very strong engine of social advance represented by the self-respect movement and the quest for social justice. Although we must point out, it coexisted with a very compromising attitude towards independence itself for a long time. This is a problem, but it's not the function of this book to delve into that, but they make a very strong case. I think that perhaps is the most important contribution made by the book. Others have written on it, but here I think combining, this is political economy at its most persuasive. I think that's important. As for Dalits, I think there is an underplaying in the book of the extreme oppression, the untouchability, the segregation that has been in place in Tamil Nadu. That's almost endemic to Tamil Nadu political economy, which is often underplayed in the media. But several years ago, a journalist, Viswanathan, who died years ago, did some excellent reporting, and this was in Frontline. It's a series of articles on the oppression of Dalits, the practice of untouchability, the segregation in the worst sense that Tamil Nadu had. And I think the Dravidian movement failed, especially when there were caste conflicts in the south between some of the backward classes and Dalits. It was painted in the media, largely in the media, as well as that is how it was treated by all the major political players in the state, barring the left parties, which are not influential enough to make a real difference on this. I think to portray them as intercaste classes, I think was to do serious injustice to the nature of that whole episode. We haven't seen it in very recent times and in the most recent period, But I think that part of the history, the ugliness of it, I think detracts from the conception of social justice that was formed and developed very impressively and influentially by the Dravidian experiences. Finally, a word on communalism. It is true that of all the major states that I am aware of, Tamil Nadu has provided the least space for the communal formations in this country, by which I really mean the Hindu right or the extreme sections of the Hindu right, the RSS and so on. It's not that they have not worked very hard, they've worked hard and they have made advances in pockets, for example, in Coimbatore and also in the south of the state. But looking at it overall, one is struck by the fact, it's remarkable, that despite all these efforts, Tamil Nadu perhaps is the best off, electorally speaking, in terms of mass base, not in terms of activity, but in terms of mass base of all the major states. In fact, the electoral base, the popular base of these forces, and are much stronger in Kerala than in Tamil Nadu. And it's quite a remarkable achievement that reference was made to my starting in the late journalism in the 60s. Yeah, that's true. It's really remarkable that from 1967, when the Dravidian movement or the DMK captured power, a major upset, electoral upset, the so-called national or All India parties have not had a look in. They've always been junior partners to one or the other of the Dravidian movement parties. And that's quite a remarkable achievement, I think. It needs deeper study, it needs political science research, but it's a good hypothesis that seeks to at least explain part of this in terms of social justice, the democratization, a process that has taken place, the sharp targeting of status-based inequalities, and mobilizing the lower caste or people belonging to the lower caste, although there is some discussion in the book on how elite sections have benefited. I have serious problems with the learning outcomes in this state, notwithstanding Jean's comparison. I think that must be true compared with other states. But there is a lot of data to show. Professor Swaminathan, I think, has referred to that also. It's been very disappointing, learning outcomes at this stage. So the quality of education is important. And here, Tamil Nadu may even suffer by comparison with some of the other southern states, in particular Kerala, where we know now that there's been a lot of investment in public schools in the government sector. And there is some data to show that I think about 650 students or so have moved into the public sector schools through, and it's happened in this term, the last 4 years, in fact. And also in areas like Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, I think there have been some very interesting attempts to strengthen education that is accessible to all. So I think these caveats have to be taken into account. But overall, a very, very important book. And I think the authors have succeeded brilliantly in their objective. And I quote from the book that this study was meant to open up a conversation on mobilization against status-based inequalities and the limits of its institutionalization within a framework of inclusive modernization. And I think those limits have been shown to be quite considerable in the last part. But overall, the Dravidian movement experiences have been very impressive, have stood out, even if they are not quite unique, and even if there is some degrading in recent years. I believe there's going to be a major political change in Tamil Nadu. All the public opinion polls have suggested that. And I think there's a great opportunity for whichever government comes into place. And I think there will be a new government, a new kind of government, to attend to these weaknesses and to build upon those strengths and to give Tamil Nadu a clean government. Because that is an area I've not had time to speak on that. I've looked into it in some detail. Corruption in Tamil Nadu, the extremely systematic and sometimes called scientific corruption in Tamil Nadu, where there are rates, everything is systematized in this. And a former finance minister told me that Tamil Nadu is number one in terms of rent seeking in the country. I don't know if that's true. In terms of corruption in every conceivable sphere, there are rates fixed. It's extremely systematized. We could talk about it, but there's no time. But that, I think, has been referred to in the book, but perhaps it needs a follow-up by the same authors or others in MIDS. I'm sorry, Chalapati, for taking more time than I intended to, but I wanted to flag these issues.